Okay, I think we are ready to get started. Again, so my name's Liz Ferguson. I'm a member of the board of directors of Dryad. A reminder, gentle one to the speakers, not to stray too far from the microphones, please. And if you're going to ask a question in this next session, please wait for one of us to bring you a microphone, because we've got more than 50 people currently watching on the live stream and trying to listen on the live stream, and they can't hear us if we're not close enough to these things. So first of all, I'm delighted to introduce Jenny Larkin, who's come to talk to us about the NIH view on open data. Jenny's the Acting Deputy Associate Director of Data Science at the NIH. I'm sure this is going to be a fantastic talk, and there'll be time at the end for questions as well.
All right, thank you. And first of all, Phil Bourne was very sorry he couldn't be here. He actually got called down to a meeting at the White House, which is why I'm here. And I think Peter both gave a hard act to follow, and you'll see a lot of similarities in what was going on. We actually did not collude while we were both sitting in separate planes on tarmacs yesterday evening. And that's the wrong computer. Here we go. Any moment now. Yay, there we go. Okay, so I was asked to present the perspective from funders and coming from the NIH, and just briefly what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll do my best to not go too long so the meeting stays on track. And one thing that I think is obvious to everybody here but bears repetition is that the nature of the scientific enterprise is changing and needs to fully transform into a digital enterprise, just like the other industries have. And the discussion in the last session was touching on this, of how even the academics have to realize there needs to be some sort of business model. And when I was thinking about this, the best example I could think of that resonated for me is the financial industry. I remember when I was in college and I was getting ready to travel abroad, it was a huge pain because you had to go to the bank and you had to get these special traveler's checks. There were these paper items and you'd have to do all these extra things, and it cost a lot of money and it was a pain, but that's what you needed to do in order to travel to a foreign country, and then you had to exchange it and all these things. And now it's dead easy. You don't have to plan ahead of time. You can forget everything. You hop on the plane, you get off the plane, and you walk up to an ATM and it spits money out at you in the correct currency in the correct amount. And this enables all sorts of ease of life. And it's that ease of life that I think you and the larger community are trying to drive the biomedical research enterprise toward. And that it is a community effort of the researchers, of the funders, and of a variety of other stakeholders, right? And so for this reason, I wanted to start off with a reminder of, because I think you are all on sort of the cutting edge, so you might forget this, where the rest of not the rest, but at least part of the biomedical research workforce is. So back in the 19th century, they also had open data and knowledge, but they had a different way that this was done. They had a different business model. So this is Lamarck, one of my favorites. So he made these observations and he came up with a theory, and these are the observations of the theory of, my lord, how do giraffes get long necks? Epigenetics. No, he was wrong. All right, so this was his observation and this is his theory. He came up with it, he had evidence and data, and then it was presented, that's not Lamarck, that's someone else, but there you go, it's a nice image, in a lovely Victorian monograph and paper. He gave talks at meetings and he published. Everything was lovely. And the net result is, this isn't Lamarck, but you know, the whole idea is to inform the general public. So this came from reaction to John Snow and his discovery of bacteria in the water of London. And so the whole idea of science is to push forward general knowledge, and here's some lovely Victorian lady being aghast at the creatures that live in the Thames. All right, so that's the sort of historical way that science is done, and that we're trying to move from that into a digital enterprise, a digital era. And this is just a sort of generic slide showing that, what is it? We expect more than 5,000 gigabytes for every person on the planet by the year 2020. All right, that's a lot of data. That's not just the digital data, and that's like all the kitty videos on YouTube take up half of that, I think. But that's the way it is. But if you bring it back down to my domain, which is biomedical data, you can say, well, it's not just cat videos, it's actually biomedical research data. So these are data from NCBI, a year too old now, but of the growth of genomic sequence data in their repositories, and you can see it's just an exponential curve, and that this is sort of case in point of the biomedical research is becoming a digital enterprise. All these data are digital and they're just expanding so rapidly. And a big reminder that it's not just genomic data. There's a wide variety of data across the NIH domain, and what we've already heard today is across a lot of other research domains as well. And a lot of the value comes in not just the richness and accessibility of this, but the ability to interconnect, like in the earlier talk where you could have mapping features of the data to the actual GPS coordinates. That enables all sorts of abilities that you couldn't do otherwise. All right, so 2 years ago, NIH and Francis Collins realized that this was a rapidly growing problem, to put it mildly. So he put together a special panel that gave a report on the Data and Informatics Working Group of what are the main challenges facing NIH with big data and how they ought to respond. And the NIH's response was, well, it's more than twofold. Part of it was to look at what NIH is doing on the inside and ensure, and Andrea Norris is leading that effort, and to ensure that they're formulating themselves for the best possible ways within NIH. But what I'm going to be talking about is the extramural response, so how NIH works with the extramural community to support biomedical research. So the first was to establish a new position that reports directly to the NIH director, the NIH Associate Director for Data Science, and that is Phil Bourne, who I'm not, but who I work for. And the other is to establish new data science research and training programs, and Peter gave a beautiful overview of the ones at NSF. And so NIH has set aside a significant amount of money through the year 2020 specifically to support this area. All right, so I'll be talking a little bit more about that. But as Phil has come on board, he's spent the first almost 3 months now, he has to move from weeks to months soon, really talking with stakeholders, with different groups outside of NIH, with different institutes and centers within NIH to try to understand what's going on. And he's really focusing the vision to say that what we're talking about here is creating a digital research enterprise. That's what the whole big data, the other word that Peter was using was the national infrastructure. They're in many ways interoperable. And Phil has also identified 5 themes, but one of the ones that generates the greatest interest, pain, whatever you want to call it, is in fact the sustainability. And I swear Peter and I didn't collude last night in coming up with these. And I also provide a link to Phil's blog where he's been putting up his thoughts before he got to NIH and where he's continuing to do so you can look at it. And one of the important aspects of the sustainability, one of it is partnering with the community. Right? Funding agencies can't solve it all alone, and that's why I'm so happy to be here, because you guys are part of the solutions. And also figure out what are the ways that can sustain. And a lot of the discussion following Peter's talk is very much along the lines of what we've been having and what we hope to do, working not just in isolation agency by agency, but as Peter is saying, working across agencies and with the communities so we can actually hopefully have an effective response. All right, so just to be clear, what we're thinking of the components of the digital enterprise is they're digital assets, right? So there are data sets, there are papers, there is software, there are workflows, there are lab notes, and there are different sort of aspects to these digital assets. And one incredibly important part is each of them should be uniquely identified, have provenance, and have access control. And so this is one of the ways to get buy-in for people to make their assets available so that they can get recognition for their use and citation. The other incredibly important part is the goal is that these digital assets should be interoperable across the enterprise. So you don't have complete silos, but where, as Peter was saying, it makes sense that they can get reused and be interoperable. This is a bigger, longer term goal, but I think it's something we should all keep in mind. So going back to the NIH report that Francis Collins commissioned of what are the big data challenges and what should we do, these are the 7 major problems essentially that the report identified. And you can see the first 3 or 4 are very much in the domain of what we're talking about today, which is locating and citing the assets, making sure that they're usable. That's what all the discussion about the metadata and data standards is all about. Associated with that are extending the policies and practices for data sharing. That's both the cultural and technological aspects, and then a variety of other activities. There are a lot more activities going on in this area than I'm going to be talking about today. I'm just focusing more on the data and software sharing aspects. So what is NIH and the Big Data to Knowledge, BD2K program doing to help make this transition happen from the Victorian lovely era to the digital enterprise era? And it's currently binned into 4 major groups. The first group of activities are facilitating the broad use of biomedical digital assets. It used to be biomedical big data, but as the conversation's gone on, we've realized it's more than just the data. The data, as you all know, are not too useful if you don't have the software, annotation, and all the other aspects of it. Also supporting the analysis, development and dissemination of analysis methods and software. So those are funding opportunities for new tools, but it's also looking into what is the infrastructure. If there are a whole batch of different programs all interested in using high performance compute clusters or cloud computing, let's make sure that where it makes sense, they're communicating across each other and not developing incoherently and not learning from each other. Important aspect, enhancing training and workforce development. There's no point in building this beautiful future if nobody knows how to use it and nobody knows how to improve on it. And the other areas is establishing the centers of excellence for biomedical data science. These are, in one sense, a use case, a test bed, and the leading edge of how it can really be done so that these successes can trickle on into other areas, or hopefully not trickle, but sort of rush on to other areas. I'd rather rush than trickle. All right, so then we're thinking, what are some of the challenges? All right, so the lovely future where there are going to be all these digital assets, there's going to be data and publications and software, and they're going to be interconnected. It will be wonderful. It'll be like not using my traveler's checks, but just walking up to the ATM in Rome. It'll be lovely. But what are the roadblocks? What are the challenges we have to think about? One is that this can only happen if the larger community works together. So not just all the different funders, but the researchers, the publishers, industry, the academics. This is not a solution that comes from any one group, but this sort of thing, this national infrastructure, has to come from the larger community of the willing working together. It requires both technological improvements and coordination of them, right? So if you have an improvement that nobody else learns about or adopts, then it's a tree in the wood falling. And the other incredibly important part is this will need associated cultural changes in the reward systems to value the sharing of digital assets. Right? And so this is a larger thing. This is when you go up for grant funding, is how well you share your digital assets and how well they have been adopted. Is that considered? When you're at your home training, your home advancement committee to go up for tenure, advancement, are they just considering grants? Are they just considering publications? Or are they also considering these other aspects? That's not something NIH controls. That's something you guys control. Right? So there are a lot of different aspects of the cultural reward systems where everybody can play a bit of the role. All right, so the other, just focus on what NIH and the Big Data to Knowledge are doing on facilitating the broad use of biomedical digital assets. So we're looking at this holistically, but we've been taking it in small pieces as we've been going along. So what we've been doing is, for example, last summer in August, we had a workshop on a data catalog. And one of the things that came out of that was, number one, don't think of it as a data catalog, but instead think of it more as an index. Work with the community, pilot things, let little pilots fail so you can learn the better way forward rather than just building big monoliths from the get-go. So that resulted in the funding opportunity that's currently under review. So we're expecting to fund the Data Discovery Index Coordination Consortium in September, in just a few months. And the whole point of that is very much along the lines of what you guys are doing here, is to really pull the community together and say, okay, so if you want to be able to find data and cite data and integrate it with publications and where it's stored and all these other things, who are the main people who are doing that? What are the big problems and what are the potential solutions to really come together as a group? In addition, last summer we had a workshop on data and metadata standards and frameworks. It was run by Mike Huerta that some of you were at and some of you chaired. And that is driving toward really, in my mind, I think of it as the usability, right? So an index will help you find data or tools and cite data and tools, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily usable or useful. For that, you need some really good metadata and data standards. And again, that's something that needs to be coming from the community and not just top down from NIH. And just last month, we had a workshop on software indexing, right? Because, and we split this up in part because of feasibility, and part because there might be unique aspects of indexing data as opposed to software. All of these workshops are archived on the BD2K website. They were video cast, and the reports, if they're not up there already, which for most of them they are, the software index report will be up there pretty soon. So that's what we're thinking of the biomedical digital assets, trying to get organized on a plan of how to do this. And again, to understand that we're not trying to do this alone, that we're very interested in working with our fellow funding agencies as well as with the rest of the community. And like I said, an essential part of this are the associated policy changes that these policy changes are both a mandate and they're both the sticks and carrots that go with the expectation for the community. So as you know, and as was previously mentioned, there was a public access to data. I provided the link, or you could Google Holdren memo and you'll find it. And it laid out expectations that funding agencies, as Peter said, were supposed to come up with plans to make publications and scientific digital data from their funded research available. And they had to come up with plans, and all the agencies are working on those now, and will start implementing them soon. But I pulled out part of it that I thought this group might be particularly interested in. And like I said, it applies to both publications and to digital scientific data. And the agencies are expected to develop a strategy for leveraging existing archives where it's appropriate, and for fostering public-private partnerships with scientific journals relevant to the agency's research. And of course, we're supposed to do this with no, as Peter said, no additional budget, which I think is possible, and in a certain sense facilitates the reusing where we can and working with the community rather than just throwing more money at something and hoping that solves it. So what do we hope will come out of BD2K, all this energy and a significant amount of funding over the next 7 years? Well, the hope is that what we're doing will enable this new digital enterprise. What we will have are researchers, clinicians, computer scientists, librarians, you name it, who can work with these digital research assets in a more facile, nimble way than this larger community can now. This enterprise will recognize and support the importance not just of publications, not just of grants, but of data, software, and analyses, and that these can all be linked together or across or interoperated against. And the goal is, of course, to ensure that more knowledge and resources that are rising from biomedical research can be more informative and reusable. The NIH mission is to improve health and understanding of disease and develop new treatments. We spend $30 billion a year. I think we can do it better. And I think that the results that come out of it can be leveraged better by turning this into a digital enterprise, both at people at the most high prestige institutions and people at other research institutions, teaching institutions, and even possibly people in their garages, right? Get this data out there to people so that they can be clever. That's what we do. If you want to find out more about what BD2K and NIH is doing in this area, I've provided the web link, bd2k.nih.gov. You can find workshops, reports, and videos there, funding opportunities as they come out, information about it, including our focus areas, structures, and people in BD2K. You can find links to Phil's blogs, and also you can join the listserv, so whenever new notices come out, you can find about it. And we also have a Twitter, so you can join Twitter there, and I include my email, and that's that.
Well, thanks to Jenny for taking us through a whistle-stop tour that's almost got us back on schedule of the NIH's agenda when it comes to open data, and I'm particularly pleased to hear that you're going to help us move out of the Victorian era and into the modern digital research enterprise. I'm sure there are plenty of questions. Martin.
Briefly touched on two topics where I would like to go or ask a little about detail, because I find them particularly challenging. One of them is clinical trial data. Making them available is both more challenging but also maybe more rewarding than some of other data sets. And number two is training and education. And I don't mean so much young research learning digital skills, but all the biomedical researchers out there that do their stuff and have been doing not since the Victorian age, but 10 or 20 years. And how do you make them change? Because I think there's a big, not resistance, but just overwhelming.
Yeah, those are great points. The second first, the training, we recognize it can't just be the young people. You also need to do training for people at all phases. Happily, we're bringing additional people into the office. So Michelle Dunn, who's from the National Cancer Institute, has been leading the training activities and the FOAs, but she's also very keen on thinking the bigger picture and also how you address what you're talking about is retraining of established people. So part of that is also ensuring that the established people see the need in order to be retrained. So either they get retrained or they ensure someone else in their lab has those skills. So we do recognize that, and we have a focus on that. The other one, you're very good, is the clinical data. We are actively discussing across the NIH, the institutes and centers, and trying to determine the best way forward. And in fact, I would expand what you're talking about beyond clinical trial data to clinical studies data, because what was touched on before is, if you're sharing data about a microorganism, you can toss it up on the web and not worry. But you start moving into human data, and you do have to start to be concerned about the privacy and security of the data, what the consent was. You can't put all data up for all purposes for those issues, and because they weren't consented for it, and yet it's very valuable. So we are intending to look very closely, specifically at the clinical study and trial data, and determine what are the most important areas to push forward, because we completely agree that's an incredibly valuable resource, and it has some distinct challenges.
One more quick one, if anyone has another question. Great. Excellent, brilliant. Well, Martin asked two anyway, so we're well covered there. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, and that's Linda Plunkett from the Boston University Libraries, who's going to talk about linking data and literature from the perspective of share.
If you could I'll put it in the presentation mode, that would be great. Hi, sorry for that little delay. I'm Linda Plunkett. I'm delighted to be here. I'm representing SHARE. I'm not representing Boston University, but I'm delighted to be part of SHARE. How many of you have heard of SHARE? Oh, good. Okay, well, you can tell me about it then, too. So SHARE has 3 organizations behind it: the Association of Research Libraries, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities, and the Association of American Universities. We have very generous funding from Sloan and from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the 3 organizations, just a little bit, behind SHARE. The Association of American Universities is an organization of 62 leading universities. These are research-intensive universities, and the AAU deals with issues from the institutional point of view and from the national point of view. This diagram shows the federal research expenditures at AAU universities. And this is the latest I could find was 2011. And for the total federal R&D funding, 58% of it went to AAU universities. So these are leading organizations. And if you look at another one, for instance, the NSF, or we could look at NIH for Jenny. Let's look at NIH for Jenny. NIH.
Sorry, could you talk to the microphone?
I am so sorry, yes. 60% of the funding from NIH in 2011 went to AAU universities. In terms of publications, AAU universities put out, is that loud enough? Okay, thank you. About 1 million publications in 2011, and that's 67% of the publications nationally and about 19% worldwide. The Association of Research Libraries, it's an organization of 125 research libraries. Their total collections budget was $1.5 billion in FY13. The APLU is a research policy and advocacy organization, and it represents 235 research universities and other institutions that are public and land-grant. It conducts about $41 billion worth of research, university-based research each year. So those are the 3 organizations behind SHARE. What is SHARE? SHARE is an initiative of higher education that is aimed at exposing the research output of university-based research so that it can be mined, reused, and built upon. This is the aim of SHARE. It certainly wants to leverage the existing research environment, and it wants to ensure that preservation, mining, and texting. So we need to work with everyone in this room, and we want to work with everyone in this room. What's the current situation? I work at a university, and it is really difficult for the Office of Sponsored Programs to know what the faculty is doing. You know those cats, herding those cats? It is really difficult to keep abreast of their publications, data sets, and other research outputs. And this is particularly true and particularly important for funded research. And there is no single structured way to report research output releases in a timely, structured, and comprehensive manner. It doesn't exist right now. So SHARE envisions itself as this robust repository ecosystem that has 4 layers. And the first layer that we will build is a notification service. And this will, through a push and pull strategy, collect research, release events, information, and pass them to the consumers. And the consumers for the notification service are organizations like the Office of Research, repositories, or funding agencies. The next layer up is the registry, And this is going to massage the data. Their base is the stream of event data that's traveling from the sources to the consumer. And it's going to be based on that event stream, and it's going to be, this is where the processing is going to occur. So they're going to be deduped, and mostly deduped at this point. And they're going to be validated using other sorts of IDs. So these two are, we're planning on the notification service first, which will link all the repositories, institutional, disciplinary, and governmental together. And then the registry will be very similar to the notification service, but it is going to be, it's going to be validated and deduped. The next layer we're planning is a discovery layer, and so that you can search, anyone can search the content of the repositories. And then the last one is very important. It's a content aggregation layer. This is going to address the needs of researchers to have computational access to the universe of research output so that they can do data and text mining. So this is a schematic of the notification service, and the sources will be publishers, repositories, institutional, governmental, and disciplinary repositories, as well as organizations such as Crossref. And they will push, or we will harvest, reports about events, research release events, as they happen. And they'll go into the share notification service, and then the consumers will be anyone, but including repository managers, offices of research, officers of sponsored programs, and funding agencies. Breaking this down a little bit, you'll see in the bottom the 3 boxes. There are 3 types of information that make up an event report, and it's event metadata, contextual information, and resource metadata. So SHARE will define event metadata, and it might be as simple as 3 identifiers. So it might be the researcher identifier, the digital object identifier, and using FundRef taxonomy, it might be the fund identifier. The contextual information will be inferred from the reports sent from the sources, and that's going to include the source's name, the identity of the source, as well as the timing, which is very, very important for the events, for the timing. And the resource metadata sources, publishers, repositories, organizations, will be able to add resource metadata if they think it is important for the consumers. And this is the other half of it. The share notification service will either push or we will harvest the data. That's up to the source, and we will get it to the consumer for their use. The consumer will be able to have predefined channels for events that Share will do. They will predefine the channel, so you could subscribe to a channel like a feed, or they will be able to search a digest of these events. And we're going for comprehensive, we're going for structured, and we're going for timely. So the registry layer, once again, this is where the deduplication and the validation will occur using identifiers. And the share registry will be a consumer of the notification service, so it gets the events to work on. What's added to this picture is the discovery layer, and the discovery layer will use existing search technology, perhaps something from the Digital Public Library of America or another web discovery source like that. Mackenzie Smith has estimated, from UC Davis, has estimated that about 95% of the structure of this is already in place. We just have to connect it. So who benefits? We all benefit from this. The researchers are plagued. They're just plagued with trying to keep apprised interested parties of their scholarly output. And the Notifications from the triggering of the notifications in the notification service will go a long way towards helping researchers keep their stakeholders apprised of their scholarly output. So they're the big winners here. A couple of the things that can help universities, the Office of Sponsored Programs, they want to optimize the relationship between researchers and funding agencies, and they'll be able to do that with this. They won't be plaguing them with, did you do this? Did you do this? No, okay. Because they will know what has happened and what hasn't happened. And universities with open access policies will be able to track the participation of their researchers. The funding agencies will be consumers. They will receive reports of research release events very quickly, comprehensively. It should help. And for the general public and industry, we are transparent. The code's out there. This can really be built upon. Search engines can be improved, but the public will know who is doing what and when. It's so structured, the data is going to be so structured that search engines will be able to render this event data so that it's more discoverable and usable, public search engines and Google. And for industry, since anyone is going to be able to search the repository contents and be able to search the digest of events, they will be able to get much more quickly the scientific knowledge that they can use for new products and new technologies. The VP and Associate Provost for Research at BU, Gloria Waters, has said that one huge problem we face is finding out what faculty are up to in terms of publications, presentations, and collaborations, and SHARE will leverage our work in tracking faculty productivity. Our institutional repository librarian, Vika Zafran, SHARE can potentially reduce our metadata harvesting effort by a lot. SHARE will provide a single nexus point for metadata for many different types of sources. So we are one solution that's out there, and I think we're going to hear from David on a second solution, and I'll let him talk about it. But just briefly, it's a publisher effort to put out a version of the articles from participating publishers that will be freely available to the public, and some of them will be embargoed for a short amount of time. SHARE is going to be working with ORCID and Crossref and other standards. This has to be standards-based. ORCID will help with disambiguating the author information from that very dirty notification stream. And on the international front, this problem of cataloging research output is global. And SHARE is already working with international organizations such as OpenAIR and JISC in order to increase interoperability for the global picture. So what about data? Right from the beginning, the first layer of SHARE is the notification service, and data is being considered research release events, and it will be reported to our consumers, to agencies, to offices of scholarly research. Down the road, we completely intend to work on the discoverability and usability of all research output, including data. And for authors' rights, the Academy really needs to retain non-exclusive rights to faculty-produced, faculty-generated publications. And we are going to work, SHARE is going to work on behalf of AAU, APLU, and ARL on the copyright issues such as open access policies, university-based open access policies, and on favorable licensing terms. And SHARE is is already helping us coordinate our efforts in the copyright strategy. So I was delighted to be invited to come and speak here today. I hope you have some questions for me. And we look forward to hearing from you. We want to work with everybody. community, a willing community. What was it, Jenny, that you said? A community of the willing. That's what we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. Does anyone have any questions for Linda? Well, I was interested by a comment you made about further down the line, Cher is going to introduce further standards that will promote the discoverability of data. Have you got anything more that you can share with us on that at the moment?
I might have misled you. We really aren't looking to create standards. We will if we have to, and we will work with the community. But we are going to try as hard as possible to use existing standards. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was thinking specifically about what Cher might be able to do within the very clear infrastructure that you've described that will help really drive the discoverability of data from within the Cher ecosystem.
Discoverability, so at that layer. Okay. The search interface that we want isn't out there yet. The DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America's interface, is broader than we want it to be. Open Door is certainly getting there, but we want to have more depth, more ability to filter with licensing terms for the data sets. So it's really in the planning stages now, that discovery layer. We're really focused on the notification service at this point.
Excellent.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's related also to the data discovery layer. Have you already had thoughts about how to integrate that with the data discovery index that NIH
No, but it was
planning
very
for?
interesting to hear about REF. Where's Jenny? I wrote that down. There you are. Where is Jenny? I wrote that down. So there's funding. I don't know. No, we haven't had thoughts on that yet.
Okay,
We
okay.
will
It's
work with
something to look
anyone,
in-
and
to look
certainly
into.
the NIH. We have a representative on our steering committee, Joyce Backus, who is from NLM, and that is that part of NIH, NLM? Yes, so she's marvelous, and she is working with us on Share.
Okay. And a second question.
Yes.
So you mentioned that McKinsey estimated that maybe 80–90%,
Yeah.
whatever, so a big
Right.
fraction
Yes.
of the infrastructure is already there. You just need to integrate it. How much effort do you think there is in curation, though, in maintaining that metadata or making sure that that metadata is correct?
I am so glad I am not a cataloger or a metadata expert. I think it's huge. I think curation is incredibly important. But I think we're going to look for there are really good efforts out there, and we're going to look to the community for that. Yeah. There's a lot within our organizations that we can tap. And since we have the top brass on board, they're willing to give. The staff have been of these organizations, AAU, have been incredibly generous with their time. So that's a terrible answer to your question. So I guess I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Next up, I'd like to introduce David Martinson from the American Chemical Society, who's going to talk about linking data and literature from the perspective of Chorus.
Thanks. Okay, like Linda, I'll start out with a disclaimer, actually 2 disclaimers. So I took this title directly from the program notes, except I changed it from the perspective from Chorus to a perspective from Chorus. So I'm not really speaking for Chorus. On the other hand, I'm not really speaking for ACS either, because I'm looking at things more broadly than just ACS. So I'm trying to give you a flavor of things that are going on within Chorus, as well as things that are happening in the industry. So a brief outline and overview of Chorus. I apologize for the fact that all my slides are somewhat different in background and format. I've borrowed liberally from my colleagues. And as I was looking at Jenny's slides and Peter's slides earlier, there's a certain beauty and simplicity that I like, but I haven't achieved that in this presentation. So Linda asked, how many of you heard of Share? How many of you heard of Chorus? Okay, good. Not everyone, but I'll give a brief overview And this will be really more focused, this early part, on the article aspects. Formed about a year ago, actually that's not on this particular slide, but had its roots a couple of years ago in a meeting with some publishers and some agency representatives, but really gathered steam about a year ago at a publisher meeting, and strategy was developed to try to help authors meet their funding mandates within existing infrastructure. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of this. A number of groups were involved in the initial formation, and both a technical working group and a steering committee. And since that time, over 100 signatories. So here's the supporting organizations, a partial list. It says 10 more down there. There may actually be more than that now, but a broad range of societies, publishers, and other organizations. And the Holdren memo, the OSTP memo, was referenced earlier. These are at least, how many are there? 5 of the requirements. Free public access to peer-reviewed research after some embargo period. 12-month was the suggested guideline. We haven't seen those final policies yet, so we don't know what's going to happen. But for those publishers involved in Chorus, there is a commitment to provide public access to one of those versions, whether it's the accepted manuscript or the open access version, the version of record. Optimized search and retrieval, there's an API involved with this that can actually help agencies or the general public do queries and get back information from Crossref on the various articles that result from funding, government-funded research. Interoperability, long-term stewardship, clocks and Portico are currently the approved archives, if you will, although there have to be some modifications in those environments to really meet the article level granularity rather than the journal level granularity that they've traditionally been involved in. So there is the public data policies that are called for, and that is something that Chorus certainly is thinking about, but it's not on the radar in terms of active addressing right now. Certainly there's a lot of different publishers that are looking at that in different ways, and I think once the article access questions have been ironed out, that then the focus will shift to data. And so we're working, interested in working with agencies. We have consultation. We also have Department of Energy is involved in an advisory capacity on the technical working group. So the big goal was to help preserve agency funds for research. And so there's an existing infrastructure, FundRef, the Crossref text and data mining services, which are built on top of a license ref metadata. And so, yes, that infrastructure is in place, but actually modifying publisher workflows to make use of that infrastructure is where the difficulty or the challenge lies. So Crossref, FundRef, ORCID, Portico, and clocks, standards that have been out there, developed over the years, relatively mature in many cases. And so there are 4 aspects to what Chorus has been focusing on in terms of articles. Identification, and so this is an example from a publisher manuscript submission site where an author will identify the funding associated with an article. And I will say that the submission systems have been developing these interfaces. Different publishers are taking different approaches as to whether they ask the author to submit that information or they extract it themselves from the acknowledgement paragraph. But I think getting that funding information accurate, a taxonomy of approved agency names has been under development, starting with Elsevier. Throughout the Chorus process over the last 6 months or so, there have been many additions to that and some normalization, but that is one of the challenges. And at an even more granular level, there's the funding, or the grant ID, the award number, and that is even a greater challenge because in our discussions with the funding agencies, there's no real easy way in a digital manner, a web transaction, to get validation of an award number. And that might be some area that collaboration with SHARE would prove very useful, because certainly the institutions have databases of that information. So that's one of the ways that we see collaboration working out. Preservation, again, clocks and Portico. Access, so the publishers within Chorus are committing to make that the version subject to the mandates publicly accessible at given embargo or immediately, depending on the journal policy, and that will be done through the Crossref mechanism. Within Crossref there will be the DOI, but there will also be a license indicator that indicates what license is associated with an article at which point in time and which version of the article it is. Discovery, I think there's a couple examples here. So the search.chorusaccess.org, you can begin typing in a funding agency name and it will expand it. And I think the interesting thing shown on this slide is that it's not solely US based. Whatever funding information the publishers submit into FundRef will be part of this interface. And so since funding is global, the information contained there is global. An example of some of the results of that, you can see some of the facets involved, and then compliance. And so there is a couple demo agency dashboards where an agency could go in and see what the level of compliance is for the articles that resulted from research funded by that agency. And right now we're in a pilot phase, and so we don't really know what the embargo periods are yet. We don't really know which agencies will decide which archives are suitable. And so a lot of this is proof of concept based on real data that has been submitted, though. And so the use cases are there, but it will take a while once the policies are finalized before that begins to really show up in a true production mode in the interface. Just a little bit about a timeline. So really between February and June of last year, things started up. Pilot launched in October, and target for production is July of this year. And I like to phrase it as production ready. We think we'll have a lot of the kinks worked out, but I'm sure there'll be some additional ones as more publishers begin to deposit things in production mode. I just lost my screen here. Chorus is a member of the SHARE working group. I think Howard Ratner, the CEO, or the executive director of Core Inc., is in the workflow working group of SHARE. And then finally, data, which is what this meeting is all about. And while Chorus for articles works on existing infrastructure, there isn't, I would say, one unified mechanism, a standard best practice recommendation or site or standard for data. That's still developing as meetings like this, the RDA meetings, host of working groups involved in those, DELSA, so on. So Chorus recognizes there's value in linking data to the papers. And we would like to be able to simplify procedures, but I think it's something that's going to involve, as previous speakers have said, a partnership. I think the last line there is important. Use of standard identifier schemes, DataCite, Crossref are interoperable at some level, and so we still see the DOI as being very important here. I'd like to focus now on the question of what is this data, and so I borrowed some slides from Eefke Smit, who many of you know, I think. And this is, I'll just skip over a couple here for time. The data pyramid, which looks at kind of the environment surrounding research data today. And so there's the the raw data and data sets that are in the labs of the researchers. There are data collections and structured databases that may be curated as a result of a specific organization going out and gathering, aggregating, and assessing that data. And then as you move up the pyramid, there's data associated with publications and maybe what we could classify as supplemental materials, kind of the top two levels of the pyramid. The next slide shows maybe where we stand today. So most of the data is down there in the bottom layer that never really sees the light of day. And publishers have been making available the data associated with those publications, again, as either within the article itself or as supplemental materials. So EFCA's ideal. Take that data that really can be integrated in the publication today, given the new technologies, minimize the stuff that's only available in supplemental materials, and maybe expand that stuff in archives. Let me just see what my next, okay. Before I go there, I was interested to see Jenny's comment on, from the NIH perspective, that even lab notes are under consideration as data objects. And I know in my community of chemists, there are probably two extremes. One is, say, the cheminformatics people that really would like to get their hands on all layers of the pyramid. And then there's the researchers that are doing the wet lab experiments, or they're doing computations and so on. And they would only like to have that top layer be the stuff that they really share publicly. And so it's that middle layer that is going to require that meeting of the minds, so to speak, that change in culture, if that's going to happen. And whether that comes imposed from the funding agencies, or if somehow the researchers will decide that ultimately they're going to do this. I think that's the very important question and the hard nut to crack here. A couple of years ago, there was a group under the auspices of NISO and NFACE that looked at supplemental journal article materials, variety, diversity of publishers, societies, government agencies, and university libraries got together and tried to hammer out some best practice recommendations for supplemental materials. There was a business working group that looked at a number of things, and I highlight here roles and responsibilities, curation, life cycle, and discoverability and linking. I think curation is an interesting question, and Dryad has some thoughts on that, but it's probably another one of those difficult ones. Is we look at what's involved in reviewing articles and the reviewer pressures of today and being asked to review so much. And now if we throw another layer of review on top of that with the data, I guess you could ask two questions. One, if they had the data, would that make the review job easier? Or two, if they had the data, would it make an additional burden on them? And as this group was meeting, the Journal of Neuroscience came out and said, we're not taking supplemental materials anymore. Yeah, we want you to put them into a repository, but we don't want our reviewers to have to spend that extra burden reviewing that stuff, that curation step. So that's an issue that is definitely something that publishers think about. The technical working group looked at came up with a number of issues as well for recommendations: metadata, persistent identifiers, and preservation. And so those three I highlight for this group because I think that's definitely things that Dryad, Dataverse, and so on are focused on. So I'm going to zip through a few slides that just show what various publishers are doing in making that linking today. These are some examples from Elsevier linking to CCDC for crystal structures. And I'd mentioned, I actually got a text or an email from Ian Bruno of CCDC earlier. He's listening online and heard my comment that when I had the microphone to ask the question, I didn't detect any difference, and he said he could. But I asked him, so I know they're registering DOIs for the crystal structures now, They're doing that through DataSite, the DataSite UK at the British Library. And so that is a case where interoperability from DOIs from articles to DOIs of data is a linking mechanism that relatively new but can be happening today. So here's an example from the Elsevier to that CCDC. GenBank, again, it takes you to GenBank site to see the data, and a list of repositories that either at the article level or within subsections of the article that linking is happening. And Elsevier Research Data Services, I don't know, Anita DeWard is on that group and has been working with universities to get experience in data repositories, data preservation from a researcher perspective. I have here an example from one of the ACS journals, and down at the bottom, this is just an abstract level, but we have links to the Protein Data Bank accession numbers there. Protein Data Bank also has DOIs for the PDB entries. So an example of some of our own supporting information policies from ACS. While some journals have just been getting into the supplemental materials since the digital age, in chemistry we've had supplemental materials for many years, going back to the late 70s and even earlier. And so here we want to be sure that the results, the conclusions of the experiments are supported by appropriate compound characterization data. And so Journal of Organic Chemistry is one that mandates a certain amount of data be submitted, and they actually have this compound characterization checklist, which their authors need to submit, indicating for each compound or structure in their study what kind of characterization data they have, some of which might be tables in the article, some of which might be spectra, but all is included in the supplemental materials. Another interesting development within the last 7 or 8 months is from the Royal Society of Chemistry, who, funded by the Research Council of the UK, is establishing a repository for the chemical sciences in the UK, a different model of funding. And then I point out some data journals. There are traditional ones like Journal of Chemical and Engineering Data from the ACS, Journal of Physical Chemical Reference Data from the American Institute of Physics, that have been around for many years. And then some of the new players, GigaScience, Geoscience Data Journal, Faculty of 1000 Research, and Public Library of Science and Nature have, within the last couple of months or the last couple of days, had some new launches as well. So I mentioned DataSite and Crossref working together. And I would just, I don't have a timeline per se, but other people have talked about timelines. And so back to 1958, there was a paper in our Analytical Chemistry Journal that talks about how feasible it might be to have punch program cards for tens of thousands of equations and the data to which they apply. So that was big data at the time. The technology probably wasn't suitable to support it at that time, but they even talk about dialing long-distance phone calls to be able to get that in a matter of minutes. So I think in the sense that there's nothing new, yeah, there's nothing new, but we have the technology today to make that a little more feasible. So I think I've zipped through a lot. One last thought, if I could. I was looking at an article in the BBC News that referenced a site by a law student at Harvard. And it was about some big data analysis that he had done using US Census data, and found that there was a 99% correlation between the divorce rate in Maine and the per capita consumption of margarine in the US. So the site is tylerweigen.org, Spurious Correlations. And so I think there's a caution there for what we can expect from big data and what we need to, kind of the mindset that we need to bring to big data, that the correlation, there may be correlations there that don't necessarily mean causality. So again, Chorus, the perspective on data is still in development, and I'm certainly here to listen as much as to share, and I think there's been some very good things, good ideas this morning, and I look forward to this afternoon's talks as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much, David. That was a fantastic oversight or insight into
Oversight.
what fantastic insight into
I left
what
Wiley
publish
off
is
of
a
the
trinity.
Maybe that was the oversight.
There's no oversight there. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask David? Well, I was wondering whether 2 years from now, or maybe a little bit longer, we might be seeing supplementary material as kind of the punch cards for what we might be facing in a few years' time. And I wonder if you're able to say anything about the role you see for publishers in interacting more with data repositories in future rather than relying on supplementary material as a source for data.
Yeah, that certainly is a very good question. And 2 years from now, it's hard to predict. I think the issues that our NISO committee talked about, and it was interesting because we had a breadth of different disciplines to see some of the challenges regarding different disciplines. So some privacy issues have been raised here, and the American Psychological Association, a lot of clinical studies, and so yeah, they have an interest or really a requirement to keep that material private, and we know from big data studies that it's oftentimes possible to identify individuals even from anonymized data. And so what do you do about that? It may be anonymized today, but will it be unanonymized at some time in the future? And it's not only clinical data. We've run into some studies where we've done some collaborations with universities, and we go in and we want to do some studies on their students. And it's not clinical, it's not really personal information, but yet it has to go through their IRB. And so we can't just go in and use their students as test subjects without considering that privacy issues. And they want to publish some of that stuff, and so that's part and parcel of it. So it creeps in a lot of unintended places. I think from my perspective today, and I'll say this is not official ACS, but I would like to really, if I'm going to be responsible for publishing the article and the data associated with that article, then I want to be pretty careful about what approved repositories it might be located at, or at least if it's not something that's under the control of our own servers, that there is some indication that, yes, this is material that came from ACS, this is related material that came from another repository. And still, we're still in the early days, so will the same repositories that are out there today still be around 2 years from now, 5 years from now?
Thank you, and that takes us right back to sustainability, but first,
Thanks, Todd.
One question. With respect to both Chorus and Share, it seems like there's data-relevant plans that are being put off to some extent because of the urgency of articles.
Right.
I'm wondering to what extent there's sort of data community involvement in the leadership of either of the initiatives.
Yeah, so I know that a couple of us who are working with Chorus have also been following the data discussions and attend some of the RDA meetings. I just got a note from Howard Ratner that I was supposed to mention that he is going to, on behalf of Chorus, join the RDA ICSU WDS group, which Research Data Alliance, International Council for Science, and World Data Services, World Data Systems, yeah. So yeah, we're following that, we're tracking that, but for Chorus, the article world is fairly well known, and so we know what we can do there, and we know what's already existing. So it's a fairly simple matter to just use that as it is. Where something is still kind of evolving, and I don't think we would find real agreement amongst all the signatories about what the best way is, or if there is a best way. You know, different disciplines may have different answers to that question.
We have one more question at the top.
Just a comment. Is a plug for RDA. So there's a group in RDA working on starting to come together to work on trusted data repositories. Not that it would be the indicator of what they are, but standards for various kinds of seals and so on. So RDA is trying to bring these groups together, as you just pointed out, and that's one place to focus on this.
Takes us to lunch, which should be served outside here. I'm going to suggest we all start again at 1 o'clock, so those people who are following us on the live stream know when to return as well. But thank you to all the speakers from this session for some really interesting new ideas.